June Calloway pushed $200,000 back across the table without ever picking up the pen. She had not seen the house. She had not asked what it was worth. She asked one question instead, and the question was whether the door had a lock. The room went silent. Then the widow of Emmett Vance stood, walked around the table, bent down to June's ear, and told her softly that some doors were safer left closed. 13 years of sleeping outdoors had taught June exactly one thing about people who smiled like that. They only whisper when they are afraid of what is behind the door. If this story finds you tonight, please subscribe and stay with June all the way to the end. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far her story travels. 4 days before that check crossed the table, June Calloway woke up at 5 in the morning behind a laundromat in Duluth, and the first thing she did was not check the time or her face. She checked the bag, 2 shirts, a pair of wool socks, a toothbrush wrapped in a paper napkin, a photograph of her father sealed inside a sandwich bag so the rain could never get at him, a folding knife in the side pouch, and one pale blue mitten hand-knit, slightly crooked at the thumb with the letter D stitched into the cuff in white thread. One mitten, not a pair. She had lost the other one when she was 9 years old, and 13 years later she still went looking for it in her sleep. She stood and her knees popped. 23 years old, and her knees popped like a woman 4 times her age. She had rules, and the rules were the only inheritance anyone had ever actually given her. Never sleep too deep in a place without a lock. Never take your boots off. Never ask for anything free. Never stay long enough in a warm lobby that someone has to decide about you. Say thank you. Wipe the sink. Make yourself easy to forget. That last one was the important one. A girl who was easy to forget got to come back tomorrow. There was a counter on Superior Street where a paper cup of coffee cost $1, and the woman at the register would let you wash your face in the bathroom if you didn't make a thing of it. June had been careful with that place for 2 years. She had never once abused it. She was on her second sip when the man in the expensive coat walked in and did the thing men in expensive coats never do, which was walk straight toward her. Her whole body went still. Her hand found the strap of the bag without her telling it to. He said her full name. Not the name she gave Shelters, not the shortened one. The whole thing, middle name, included the way it had appeared on a birth certificate she had never held in her hands. He said he was an attorney. She said nothing because attorneys meant courts, and courts meant nothing good for a girl with no address and no fixed anything. He said he had been looking for her for 9 days. She asked him what he wanted, and he asked whether he could sit down. She looked at his shoes first, polished but scuffed at the toe, then his eyes, tired, not cruel tired, old tired. She nodded once, and Theodore Marsh sat down like the chair cost him something. Then he told her a man named Emmett Vance had died 12 days earlier of a stroke. The name went through her like cold water down the wrong pipe. She had not heard it spoken aloud in 13 years, not since a church parking lot in the rain, not since a man in a black coat had knelt down in front of a 9-year-old girl in wet shoes, put both hands on her shoulders, and promised her that he was going to take care of everything. She had believed him for a long time. She had believed him through the first foster home and most of the second. Somewhere around the 4th, she had stopped believing him, and somewhere around the 6th, she had started hating him, and that had been simpler, and she had kept it. She told Marsh she was sorry for his loss and asked him to leave. He did not leave. He said Emmett Vance had left instructions concerning her. She stopped with the bag halfway to her shoulder and asked what kind of instructions, and Theodore Marsh opened a leather briefcase and told her the truth in one word: a will. 3 days later, she stood on a sidewalk in Marquette and seriously considered walking away from the whole thing. The law office was red brick with big windows and a brass plate by the door, the kind of building she would have crossed the street to avoid a week earlier. She had spent 20 minutes in a bus station restroom trying to make her hair look like a person's hair. Marsh had told her she did not need to bring anything. She brought the bag anyway. She always brought the bag. The receptionist looked up and did the sweep in under a second. The donation coat too big in the shoulders, the boots, the canvas bag, and then made a decision and immediately tried to hide the fact that she had made one. June had watched that exact expression happen on 1,000 faces. It never got easier and it never got surprising. Then the door opened and Cordelia Vance came in, and June understood at once that she had been wrong to expect a villain. The woman was beautiful. 63 silver blonde hair, pinned back pearls, a charcoal suit cut for a body that had never once had to sleep sitting up. She had a face that had learned decades ago exactly how much to smile and precisely when to stop. Behind her came a man in his early 30s with a loosened tie and the expression of somebody who had already lost an argument in the car. Cordelia said his name, Desmond, and told him to behave in the light voice people use when they want a room to hear them being gracious. Desmond looked at June's boots, then at her bag, then away. Marsh read for 11 minutes, and for 11 minutes June sat with her hands flat on her knees and understood almost none of it. Emmett Vance had lived in a world she could not picture. A processing plant on the lake, cold storage, contracts, freight foundations, charitable boards, a house with a name instead of a number. Cordelia received the family home and most of the public wealth. Desmond received shares in Vance Lake Works and a marina down the coast. June stared at her hands and waited for it to be over. She had come because the bus ticket was included and because a part of her she did not like wanted to see the faces of the people who had received what she never had. Then Marsh turned a page and said her name. To Juniper Rose Calloway, he read he left the property at 27 Gull Ash Road, outside the village of Harrow Bay, including the residence and approximately 24 acres of surrounding land. She had to ask him to say it again. Desmond made a small sound that was half a laugh and half a cough, and said out loud that he was amazed the thing was still standing, that the last time anyone looked at Gull Ash, it was one storm from going over the cliff that you could push it down with a shopping cart. His mother said his name once quietly, and he stopped. June asked Marsh whether it was hers. He said yes. She asked whether there was a mortgage. He said no. Something inside her went very quiet. No mortgage, no landlord, no caseworker flipping the lights on at 6 in the morning, telling everyone to gather their things. This isn't a hotel, gather your things. She looked down at the blue canvas bag between her boots, at everything she owned, and she asked the only question that had ever mattered to her. She asked whether the door locked. Nobody answered. Desmond frowned and asked her to repeat it, and she repeated it without looking at him, and Marsh finally took off his glasses and said yes, it did. She swallowed hard and said in a voice smaller than she wanted that it was more than she'd had yesterday. For a moment, nobody spoke at all, and in that silence, June felt Cordelia Vance lean forward and felt the temperature of the room change and understood that the real meeting was just beginning. Cordelia's voice was gentle, and it was the kind of gentle that had been practiced in mirrors. She asked whether she might call her June. She said Emmett had been sentimental near the end. She explained that the property had been neglected for many years, that the roof and the wiring and the plumbing would take a fortune, that even then, and here she paused delicately, it was not the sort of place a young woman should be alone. June said she had been alone in worse places. The smile did not move. Something behind the eyes did for less than a second. Most people would have missed it. June had spent 13 years learning to read the exact moment when kindness turns into inconvenience. The way a hand drifts toward a phone, the way a manager's voice drops half a step, the way a stranger's face closes like a register drawer. She did not miss it. Then Cordelia reached into her handbag and slid a folded paper across the table and said she would like to make the whole problem go away right now today so that June never had to worry again. $200,000 for the property, cash wired anywhere she liked by morning. June looked at the paper. She did not touch it. She tried to make her mind hold the number, and her mind refused. She had counted her life in single dollars for so long that anything with that many zeros stopped being money and turned into a foreign language. It was not a sum. It was a door out of her entire existence, a room with a radiator, a refrigerator with food inside it, boots bought new instead of donated, a bed with sheets that nobody else had slept in first. She could feel Cordelia watching her. She could feel Desmond watching her. She could feel the receptionist down the hall pretending not to listen. And she thought about a 9-year-old girl who had gone to sleep in her shoes in a stranger's house because she did not know where morning would take her, and who had waited every single night for a man in a black coat to come back. That girl was still waiting. June slid the paper back across the table and said, "No, thank you." Cordelia blinked. Once, but she blinked. Desmond laughed under his breath and told her to go see it, fine, see it, and then take the money. Cordelia raised one hand without looking at him And he went quiet, and June filed that away. The speed of it, the obedience of a grown man in an expensive suit. Cordelia said the offer was more than generous. She said she was trying to be kind. And the terrible thing, the thing that made June's skin crawl, was that the kindness was real in the way heat from a stove is real. Warm, careful, perfectly measured, radiating outward, and behind it something colder that had nothing to do with June at all. Cordelia Vance wanted the house, not the sale, not the land. The house. June did not know why, but she knew what wanting looked like on a person who believed they were hiding it because she had spent a decade watching people want things they were ashamed of wanting. Then Marsh cleared his throat and said there was one additional item. He drew a thick red envelope from the briefcase with her name written across the front in a slightly uneven hand, and June's chest closed like a fist because she knew that handwriting. She had seen it exactly once on a small white card that had come with a stuffed bear at her father's funeral. She had lost the card in the 3rd foster home and the bear in the 5th. She had not lost the handwriting. Marsh said Emmett had instructed him to give it to her only if she came in person. Then he set 2 keys on the table beside it. The first was small and silver and ordinary. The second was old, heavy brass, worn smooth, in the center where a thumb had rubbed it over and over for years. June reached for the brass one first. She could not have said why. Marsh watched her do it and said quietly that Emmett had asked him to make sure she received that one last. And Cordelia Vance's eyes moved to the brass key, and for the first time since walking into the room, her smile slipped. Half a second, then it was back flawless. But June had seen it, and Cordelia knew she had seen it, and something passed between the two of them across that table that neither one said out loud. Cordelia stood and reached for her coat. She stepped around the table and paused beside June's chair and lowered her voice so that only June could hear, and told her that some doors were safer left closed. Then she smiled once more, warm and practiced, and walked out. Desmond followed her. At the door he looked back once, and he did not smile, and there was something in his face that June could not name yet, something closer to a man who has just heard a tone in his mother's voice that he did not want to have heard. June waited until the footsteps were gone from the hallway, then she asked Marsh whether Emmett had ever said why he left her the house. Marsh took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose and said Emmett had said one thing about it. He said Cordelia notices what things cost. Then he put his glasses back on and finished it. He said June notices what they mean. Her eyes filled. She looked down at the brass key so he wouldn't see. Alone in the conference room a few minutes later, she opened the red envelope. Inside was a single card with 3 lines on it. He wrote that she had survived because she learned to see what other people ignored. He wrote that she should never trust what looked worthless. And then he wrote 2 words that put her hand over her mouth: come home. Nobody had told June Calloway to come home in over a decade because for over a decade there had been nowhere for her to go. She cried the way she had learned to sleep quietly so that no one would notice, and then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and picked up her bag and went to find the northbound bus. 3 rows behind her, a man in a dark jacket lowered his phone. He had just photographed the back of her head. He sent it to a contact, saved as a single letter along with 4 words. She's on her way. The driver let her off at a closed bait shop and pointed north and told her Gull Ash Road was about 4 miles that way and asked if somebody was picking her up. She gave him her small practice smile and said she'd manage. She always did. The pines got taller. The houses stopped. The road turned to gravel. Somewhere ahead, she could hear the lake doing that low, steady breathing thing, and her body remembered it before her mind did. Every 10 minutes or so, she looked behind her out of habit, and once far down the road, she thought she saw headlights that were gone the next time she looked. 2 hours later, in the last of the light, she found the mailbox with the numbers eaten gray by weather. Desmond had been right about one thing. It was almost a ruin. The porch leaned like an old man favoring a bad hip. Half the shingles were gone. One window was boarded with warped plywood. A shutter hung by a single nail. June stood at the end of the drive and laughed. A tired, soft, broken little laugh. The laugh of someone who has finally arrived at the last place she was afraid to reach. Because everyone else in the world would have seen decay, and June Calloway saw walls. She saw a roof mostly. She saw a front door. She climbed the porch, and the boards groaned under her. She slid the silver key into the lock, and it turned with a small click that she felt in her chest. She stepped inside. She closed the door behind her. She locked it 3 times. Only then did she breathe. She built a small fire in the stone hearth that night, and when the chimney drew clean, she nearly cried at that too. She ate crackers from her bag. She drank water from a plastic bottle. There was no electricity, and she did not care because for the first time in years, there was no stranger sleeping 6 feet away from her. She spread her coat on the floor, put the bag under her head, and let her eyes close. She was almost asleep when she noticed the ashes. June sat up. Her fire was small and had burned down to a soft glow, but underneath the new coals there was an older layer of ash, gray and soft and undisturbed. Not years old, days old. Someone had used this fireplace. Her hand moved slowly to the iron poker leaning against the stone. She looked at the front door, locked. She counted her own heartbeats and made herself breathe through her mouth so she could hear. Outside, a porch board creaked under a foot that did not want to be heard. Another step, closer. Then the doorknob turned a 1/4 inch, stopped and turned again. June rose without a sound and asked who was there, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, and nothing answered. The porch creaked once more as whoever it was took a step back. Then 3 hard knocks struck the door, and a man's voice, old and weathered and calm, said her name. He said his name was Otto Lindqvist, and that Emmett Vance had asked him to look after this property. June did not lower the poker. She told him to prove it. There was a pause. Then the man laughed one short laugh, not mocking, almost fond, and said she had more sense than Emmett had given her credit for. A photograph slid under the door. She crouched with one hand still on the poker and picked it up. It was old, the corners bent, and it showed a younger Emmett Vance in a canvas jacket standing beside a broad-shouldered, bearded man, and behind the two of them stood this house. She slid the chain across and opened the door 2 inches. The man on the porch matched the photograph, only older, his beard gone almost white, his face carved by 40 winters off the lake. His eyes went straight to the poker in her hand, and he said quietly, "Good." He told her never to open a door out here without something in her hand. She asked him how long he had known Emmett. He said since they were 19. She asked him why Emmett had left her this place. Otto Lindqvist did not answer right away. He looked past her at the small fire, at the old ash underneath it, and his whole face changed. He said Emmett left it to her because he hoped she would notice. She asked him notice what, and he asked to come inside, and she stood there for 3 long seconds with 13 years of instinct screaming at her before she slid the chain off and stepped back. He wiped his boots on the mat. He walked straight to the hearth and knelt down in front of it like a man at a grave. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into the fireplace and gently brushed the old ash aside. Beneath it, set flat into the stone, was a small iron ring. June's heart began to slam. She said that had not been there before, and Otto said it had been there the whole time. She simply could not see it. He closed his fingers around the ring and pulled, and somewhere beneath the floor of a condemned boathouse that everyone in 3 counties had called worthless, something old and carefully oiled clicked and began to move. The stone under the hearth lifted, the way a coffin lid lifts slow and clean and wrong, and June Calloway stepped back so fast she hit the wall. Cold air came up out of the opening, not damp air, not the smell of a cellar, dry, filtered, controlled air, the air of a place somebody had built on purpose and kept alive. 10 steps down, a light clicked on by itself. She asked Otto what was down there, and he did not answer her, which was its own answer. She asked him again, and he stood up and brushed the dust off his knees and told her Emmett had started building it 3 years ago, right after his accountant died. She asked what an accountant dying had to do with a hole in her floor, and Otto looked at her with a face like a man handing over a loaded thing and said, "That was the whole question, wasn't it?" Her hand went into her coat pocket and closed around the brass key. She went down. The stairs were narrow, and her shoulder dragged the concrete the entire way. At the bottom was a steel door with no handle on it, only an old brass lock set into metal that did not belong in a house that leaned. She fit the key in. It turned like it had been waiting for her since before she was born. Behind her, from the top of the stairs, Otto said her name and told her to remember one thing, whatever she found in there. She looked back at him. How was a shape against firelight? He said Emmett had been ashamed. She asked him ashamed of what? And the old man dropped his eyes and said of how long it took him to see what they had done to her. June turned back to the door, put her palm flat against the cold of it, thought about a 9-year-old on wet church steps, and pushed. There was no gold, no cash, nothing that looked like anything a person would put in a story. There were shelves, filing cabinets, archive boxes stacked and labeled, a desk with a lamp and a laptop and a leather journal, and everything in that room was dry and clean and protected in a way that nothing in June Calloway's entire life had ever been protected. She walked to the desk like a woman walking into water. The journal had a name pressed into the leather in small gold letters. She touched it with 2 fingers. She opened it, and the first page had one line on it. If June is reading this, then I finally found a way to bring her home. She closed the journal, pressed her hand over her mouth, and stood there in the yellow light of a room she had not known existed under a house she had not known she owned. And for the first time since she was 9 years old, June Calloway cried without trying to be quiet about it, not because she had been given something, because someone had kept her. In a drawer, in a will, in a sentence, somewhere for 13 years, she had existed in another person's mind. The laptop had one file on the screen. It had her name on it. She sat down in a dead man's chair and clicked it. Emmett Vance looked out at her from a hospital bed, thinner than his photographs, and before he said a word, he held something up to the camera, an old picture soft at the corners, a young woman with tired eyes on a hospital bed, holding a baby wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, looking down at that baby with an expression June had spent her entire life trying to remember and never once managed. Her hand went to the mitten in her pocket. The letter D, Della, her mother's name. The word came out of her in a whisper to an empty room, and it broke on the way out because for 13 years June had believed that woman had chosen to walk away from her. Then Emmett lowered the photograph and said her name, and his voice cracked on it. He said he had made her father a promise before she was born and made her a promise the day he buried him, and that he had failed to keep both of them for a very long time. He said he could tell her he'd been busy or that he'd trusted the wrong people, and both of those would be true, and neither would be enough. So he wasn't going to ask her to forgive him. He was going to tell her what happened because she deserved to know, and because there were things in that room she needed to understand before certain people came looking for them. Then he told her about the trust. Her father and Emmett had set it up while her mother was still pregnant. He said that part twice, slowly, and asked her to hear it clearly. Before she was born, her father had made sure she would be taken care of. School, medical care, a home whenever she needed one, and at 21 enough to give her a start, not a fortune, a start. He said she should never have slept outside, not one night, not 1 hour. June's eyes closed. Somewhere above her, the lake kept breathing. He said that 3 years ago his accountant died and a new firm came in to review everything routine, nothing more. And that was when he found the transfers, small at first, from a trust he'd almost forgotten existed, hers, then larger, routed through consulting firms he didn't recognize, then through a foundation, then a second foundation, then into private accounts. It took him 18 months to follow it all the way down. Then he looked directly into the camera and said he wanted to say this part slowly so there could be no mistake. The person moving the money out of her trust was his wife. June's whole body went cold. She thought of a hand on the back of a chair. She thought of the word dear delivered like a warm towel. She thought of a woman who had looked at the canvas bag between her boots and had never once looked at her face. Emmett kept going because he had clearly rehearsed this until he could get through it. He said Cordelia had done it through the charities, and that was the part that shamed him because he had helped her build those charities. He had stood next to her at ribbon cuttings. He had signed the checks. He had been proud of her. And then he named the cities: Duluth, Ashland, Marquette, Green Bay, a network of shelters and outreach programs strung along the lake, places where nobody with power ever checks the paperwork too closely because the people the money is meant for don't have attorneys. June stopped breathing. She knew those cities. She had slept in those cities. She had eaten out of those kitchens. She had signed her name in those intake books, in the wobbly cursive of a 15-year-old, then a 16-year-old, then a 17-year-old, praying the bunk would still be there when she got back from a shift. Her money had bought the soup she stood in line for. She heard a sound come out of her own throat that she didn't recognize. Emmett's voice went very soft, and he told her he was sorry. Then he said it again, and it was worse the second time. She was shaking, and it wasn't the theft. It was the shape of the thing. Cordelia Vance, under warm lights, silver-haired and beloved, handing an oversized check to a program June had eaten dinner at. Somewhere in Marquette, a paid photographer had taken a picture of that woman smiling beside a donated pot of soup, and somewhere in that same building on that same night, a 17-year-old had been curled on a cot with her boots on, sleeping light in case somebody took her bag. June laughed once, sharp and broken, and then covered her mouth with both hands. Because she had blamed herself. Every job she lost because she had no address. Every apartment application she couldn't fill out. Every foster mother who looked at her across a kitchen and quietly decided she was too much work. Every closed door, every crossed street, every stranger's face going flat. She had believed there was something wrong with her. She had believed her father left her nothing. She had believed her mother walked out because June had not been worth staying for. She had spent 13 years doing the arithmetic on herself. If she were easier to love, quieter, prettier, luckier, better, someone would have kept her. All of it was a lie built on top of a 9-year-old in wet church clothes. Then Emmett said there was more and that it was about her mother. Her hand crushed the mitten inside her pocket. He said her mother had not left the way she thought. He said he had not found her yet, but he had been trying because when he started following Cordelia's money, he had come across her name. June leaned toward the screen so hard the chair moved. He said Della had been lied to as well. Then he opened his mouth to say more, and he coughed once, twice, then hard, and a nurse stepped into the frame with a hand on his shoulder, and Emmett raised one hand toward the camera and said, there was one more thing she had to know about Cordelia, one more thing, and that she had... The file ended. The screen went black. June sat frozen in that chair for a long time. Then she took the mitten out of her pocket and laid it flat on the desk beside the laptop and smoothed it with both hands and told a woman she had spent 13 years hating that she was sorry that she hadn't known that she hadn't left her. She said it twice. The second time she believed it. Cordelia Vance came for the house 2 days later. Not with police, not with lawyers, with coffee. June saw the black SUV through the front window at 9 in the morning, and her first instinct was to reach for the bag. Her hand actually moved. It was on the back of a kitchen chair where she had hung it 13 years of practice, hanging there ready to go in under 3 minutes. And she stopped with her arm in the air and thought about the yellow room under her feet, and she thought, no, not this time. She opened the door before Cordelia could knock. The woman was on her porch holding 2 paper cups, wearing camel wool, and the same pearls and the same smile with Desmond a step behind her, and she said she thought they might talk. June said no. Cordelia asked if they could come in. June said no again, and that surprised all 3 of them, June most of all. Desmond stepped forward and said $250,000, no greeting, just the number thrown down like a card. June let herself picture it for 3 seconds, then she asked him why. He blinked and asked why what? She asked why a leaning house on 24 acres in the middle of nowhere on a shoreline that loses 10 inches a year was worth $250,000 to people who had called it a shack in front of their own attorney 6 days ago. His jaw moved. He didn't have an answer, and June watched him not have one and watched his mother watch him not have one. Cordelia stepped smoothly into the gap and said her son was impatient. June said she'd noticed. Then Cordelia did the thing she had clearly come to do. She said she had known June's parents. 6 words laid down soft as a napkin over a knife. June felt her own spine straighten. Cordelia said her father had been one of the most loyal men she'd ever met, that he and Emmett had fished this shoreline when they were both 20. June asked about her mother. Cordelia paused just slightly and said her mother had been lovely. June asked whether she had known Della had a daughter. The hesitation was very small. Cordelia said, of course. June asked whether that meant she had known about her. Nobody said anything. Desmond's eyes went to his mother and stayed there. Cordelia said she had known that Nathaniel and Della Calloway had a child. Yes. June took one step forward and said that Cordelia donated to shelters in Duluth. Cordelia said she donated to many organizations. June said she had slept in one. The wind moved in the pines, and nobody on that porch said a word. And Cordelia Vance looked away first. It lasted less than a heartbeat. It was there, and then it was gone, and when her face came back, it was warm again, sad again, kind again, practiced again, and she asked June please to take the offer. June said no. So Cordelia listed it out gently, the way you'd explain a bus schedule to a child. June was 23. She had never owned property. She had no idea what taxes were or insurance or what a new roof cost, and June said she was right. Cordelia actually blinked. June said she was right, that she didn't know any of those things, yet that she was going to learn. Desmond said something about learning it in a house with no electricity, and June looked at him and said she had done harder things with less, and he opened his mouth and closed it again. Cordelia touched her son's sleeve with two fingertips, and he stepped back like a dog that had been trained young, and for the first time the warmth in that woman's face thinned out and something underneath it showed through. She told June to take the offer. June asked why, and Cordelia Vance said because some doors are safer left closed, twice now. Two different rooms, the same sentence word for word, and June understood in that moment that she was not talking to a person. She was talking to a shape a person had learned to wear. She thanked her for the coffee she hadn't taken and asked her to leave. Cordelia smiled once more sadly, perfectly told her not to take too long, and walked down the steps. Desmond followed. At the bottom, he glanced back once at the leaning porch and once at June, and he did not smile, and there was something in his face like a man who had just heard a tone in his mother's voice that he was going to be thinking about at 2 in the morning. June stayed standing until the sound of the engine was gone. Then her knees started shaking, and she sat down hard on the top step and pressed her forehead into her hands and did not get up for a long time. Otto came out of the trees 20 minutes later with a thermos, sat down beside her without asking, poured and held out the cup and told her it wasn't poisoned, and she almost laughed. She told him Desmond was right, that she didn't know how to do this, that she didn't know how trusts worked or what property law was, that yesterday she had read one page of Emmett's journal 3 times and understood maybe half the words in it. Otto said that tracked. She said that wasn't helpful. I said no, but it was honest, and then he told her Emmett Vance hadn't known how to run a freight company either when he started one. She said Emmett had money, and Otto said no, Emmett had a borrowed truck and her father's phone number. June went very still. Otto pulled a business card out of his jacket and held it out without looking at her. Harriet Nash, attorney at law, Marquette. June asked whether the woman would believe her. Otto shook his head and said no. Her face fell before she could stop it. Then he glanced over and said she'd believe the evidence, and that was better, and he stood up and left the thermos on the porch and told her to keep it. It was going to snow. Harriet Nash was 68 with short silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain and the unnerving habit of not filling silences. She just let them sit there until whoever was across from her started saying more than they'd planned to. June sat in a small office above a bookstore with everything spread across the desk. Copies of the journal, ledger printouts from the yellow room, screenshots from the video. Harriet read for 2 hours and did not say one word. Then she took her glasses off, set them down, and said the name Cordelia Vance out loud like she was testing a floorboard. She told June that this woman had spent 25 years building a reputation for generosity in this state. Hospital boards, children's charities, housing programs. Her name was on a plaque in a wing of a hospital Harriet's own sister had been treated in. Then she folded her hands and said that if this became public, one question would follow June into every courtroom and every newspaper in Michigan, and asked if June knew what that question was. June looked her in the eye and said it. Why would anybody believe a homeless girl over Cordelia Vance? Harriet's mouth moved just slightly. June said they shouldn't. That they should believe the record's not her. The old woman stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once slowly and pulled the folder across the desk and said, "Good answer." Then she laid out the rules. They would not threaten Cordelia. They would not call reporters. They would not make one accusation they could not prove on paper. They would follow every dollar and build a trail so tight that woman could not walk out of it sideways. She warned June it would be ugly, that Cordelia would fight, and that she would hurt her in ways that had nothing to do with money. June said she knew. And then Harriet asked the question nobody had asked June Calloway in her entire life. She asked what she wanted out of this. June opened her mouth, closed it, thought about the yellow room, the video, a photograph of a young woman with tired eyes holding a baby in a pale yellow blanket. She said she wanted to know where her mother was. Harriet was quiet for a beat, then nodded and said, "All right, we'll add that." The first photograph appeared online 11 days later. June was standing outside a bus station in Duluth in it. She recognized the coat, she recognized the bag, she recognized the way her own chin was tucked into her chest, the posture of a person trying to take up less room in the world. The headline above it called her a homeless woman claiming a connection to the Vance fortune. By that afternoon, there were 3 more articles. By evening 7, Some called her a mystery heiress. Some called her an opportunist. A local commentator asked in a very concerned voice why a respected businessman would leave any part of an estate to a transient with no verified employment history, and that clip played for a week. Harriet called after dark and told her not to read the comments. June said she already had. Harriet said, then stop. And June sat down on the kitchen floor with the phone in her lap and did not move for an hour. The papers came the next morning. Cordelia was challenging the will, diminished capacity, undue influence, possible exploitation of an elderly man. June almost laughed. Then she stopped, almost laughing, because the third page named her specifically, and the language in it was designed to do exactly one thing: make a jury look at a girl who had slept behind a laundromat and see a con. So she started reading. She read until her eyes burned. She wrote unfamiliar words in the margins of a cheap spiral notebook and looked them up one at a time on a library computer 2 towns over. Fiduciary, beneficiary, misappropriation. She learned that there are people whose entire job is making theft look like an administrative error. In meetings, men in good suits explained things to Harriet while barely looking at June. Once a forensic accountant asked whether June wanted to wait outside while the adults handled the numbers. Harriet very slowly began to remove her glasses. June touched her arm and said no thank you politely. Then she turned to the accountant and asked him about page 47. The transfer dated March 8th, 4 years earlier. She asked why it had been routed through a housing charity in Ashland before it reached a consulting firm in Delaware. The room went silent. He turned to page 47. He never asked her to wait outside again. She learned quickly what she didn't know. She learned faster what she did. She knew shelters. She knew intake procedures. She knew which programs gave receipts and which never had. She knew which cities posted their donor rolls online and which kept them on paper in a file drawer that a foundation secretary forgot to lock at 4 o'clock on a Friday. She knew because she had watched from cots, from folding chairs, from the end of the coffee line for years, and nobody had ever thought to notice her noticing. Harriet watched her map out the whole geography of Cordelia's, giving one afternoon, and said only one thing. She said, "You paid attention." June didn't answer because she hadn't paid attention. She'd had to. When you sleep in a place, you learn it. That was survival, and now for the first time in her life, the thing that had kept her alive in alleys was the thing nobody else at that table had. Then Harriet drove out to Gull Ash Road on a Tuesday with her mouth set in a line, and June knew before the car door shut. Cordelia's attorneys had filed for temporary control of the property. June asked if they could take the house. Harriet said they could try, and that if a judge granted it, June would lose control of who saw what was under that floor and when. That night, June sat by the fire until the fire went out. And at 2 in the morning, she got up in the dark and did what she had done 100 times before in 100 worse places. She packed the bag, 2 shirts, wool socks, toothbrush, her father's photograph, the mitten. It took 2 minutes and 40 seconds. 13 years of practice had made leaving the easiest thing she knew how to do. She pulled on her coat, put the strap over her shoulder, walked to the front door, and put her hand on the lock. She stood there with her hand on the lock for a long time. Every part of her that had kept her alive since she was 9 was screaming to turn it. That was the voice that had gotten her out of the 3rd foster home before the man who lived there finished a sentence. That was the voice that had gotten her off a bus in Green Bay 2 stops early because a guy in the back kept looking at her bag. That voice had never once been wrong, and it was telling her the same thing it always told her, which was that a person like her does not fight. A person like her leaves first, because leaving first is the only kind of winning available. She thought about Desmond saying she'd still be homeless with an address. Maybe he was right. Maybe people like her didn't keep houses. Maybe you could hand a girl a deed and she would still in the end be a girl who slept in her boots. She closed her eyes. She stood in the dark with the strap cutting into her shoulder, and then for a reason she could not have explained to anyone, she went downstairs instead. She sat down in Emmett's chair with the bag still on her in front of a dark laptop and said out loud that she had tried. There was nobody to answer her. She reached for the journal without meaning to pick it up, and her fingers slipped on the cover, and it went off the desk and hit the floor and fell open near the back. She bent down to get it and stopped. There was handwriting inside the back cover, very small. She had never seen it because she had never turned the book over. One line, a home is not a place where nobody can remove you. And underneath it, in a shakier hand, written later when the man's body had already started leaving him, a home is where you finally decide to stay. June read it once, twice, a third time. Her hand went slowly to the strap on her shoulder, and she understood the whole thing in one cold, clean second. Cordelia did not need to win in court. She only needed June to run. That was the entire strategy. That was why the offer got bigger instead of smaller. That was why the photograph went online. That was why every article used the word transient. Cordelia Vance had spent 25 years around people who ran. She funded the buildings they ran to, and she knew exactly what June was because she had been robbing girls exactly like June for over a decade. She was not fighting a lawsuit. She was waiting for a habit. June slid the bag off her shoulder and held it against her chest, and she did not move for a long moment. Then she set it down on the floor and said no out loud, and her voice shook and she said it again louder. She went upstairs and turned on every lamp Otto had gotten working. She unpacked the bag onto the kitchen counter, one shirt in a drawer, the other shirt in a drawer. Socks, toothbrush by the sink out in the open where a person who lives somewhere puts a toothbrush. Then she unwrapped her father's photograph, which she had kept sealed in plastic since she was 10 years old, and she found an old wooden frame in the hall closet and cleaned the glass with her sleeve and put him on the mantel. And she laid the mitten flat beside him, the letter D facing out. Not packed, not hidden, where anybody walking into her house would see it. She stepped back and looked at two small objects on a shelf. A father, a mother. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was here. At 7 in the morning, she called Harriet and asked her to tell the truth about whether they were going to win. And Harriet was quiet for 3 full seconds and then said she didn't know. June nodded at a phone that couldn't see her nod and said, all right. Then she said she was staying. There was a pause on the line. Then Harriet's voice changed and she said, good. June was about to hang up when Harriet said her name again and hesitated. And June had known that woman for 6 weeks and had never once heard her hesitate. Harriet said she had news about her mother. June's free hand found the edge of the counter. She said Della Calloway was alive. The house went very quiet. Somewhere above her, the roof creaked. June heard none of it. Vermont, Harriet said. A small town, almost 12 years in the same place. June pressed her forehead into the counter's edge and asked if she wanted the address. And June closed her eyes and thought about a woman with tired eyes holding a baby in a pale yellow blanket, and about a promise made on a porch a lifetime ago, and she said not yet. Harriet didn't say anything. June said she was sorry. Then she said she didn't want to meet her mother while she was still a person who ran. There was a long silence on the line, and then Harriet said very quietly, all right. The courtroom in Marquette was smaller than June expected. She sat beside Harriet in a gray jacket from a second-hand shop that fit at the shoulders, hair washed the night before in her own kitchen sink, and she was not carrying the blue canvas bag. It was at home. The words still felt strange in her mouth, like a coin she hadn't earned. Cordelia Vance sat across the aisle in navy and pearls and looked as she always looked, like the room had been built around her. Behind her in the first row sat Desmond, and he was not looking at his mother, and he was not looking at June. He was looking at his own hands. June noticed that. She filed it away. She did not know yet what it meant. Harriet did not tell the court that June was homeless. She never said the word. She did not describe the laundromat or the intake books or the cot in Ashland, and she did not ask a single person in that room to feel sorry for her client. She did the opposite. She put paper on the table, dates, signatures, trust records, transfers, a slide, then another money, moving out of an account that was supposed to keep a child warm, sliding through a foundation, then a consulting firm in Delaware, then a second foundation, then into a private account bearing a name Cordelia Vance had signed on 22 separate documents. Cordelia's attorneys fought every page of it. They called the transfers administrative errors. They said the accounting had been confused during a leadership transition. They said decisions had been made by employees who were now conveniently dead. They said a woman as generous as Cordelia Vance could not possibly have known what was happening inside her own foundations. And that was when Harriet Nash stood up and said she would like to call Desmond Vance to the stand. The room went still in a way June could feel on her skin. Cordelia turned her head slowly and looked at her son, and June watched her do it and watched Desmond not look back. He stood, he buttoned his jacket, he walked to the witness box like a man walking somewhere he had been putting off for most of his adult life. He raised his hand and swore to tell the truth and sat down. Harriet asked him to state his relationship to the defendant, and he said she was his mother. She asked whether he had grown up in the Vance household with Emmett Vance. He paused. It was a small pause, and June felt it in her chest. He said yes. Harriet asked whether Emmett had been his stepfather, and Desmond Vance said he was my father. Cordelia's face did not move, but something inside it went out like a light in a far room. Harriet let the sentence sit there. Then she carried a single document to the witness box and asked whether he recognized the signature on it. He looked at his own name and said yes. She asked if he had authorized the transfer of funds out of the Calloway Trust to the Bright Harbor Foundation 4 years earlier. He said he had signed what his mother put in front of him. Harriet asked if he had known at the time of signing that the beneficiary of that trust was a living person. Desmond's jaw tightened. He looked down. He looked back up. He said he had been told the trust was inactive, told by whom Harriet asked, and Desmond Vance looked at his mother for the first time since he'd sat down and said by her. Cordelia closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. June saw it. Then Harriet took a second document off the table and set it in front of him and said that 2 weeks ago he had walked into her office carrying a folder and asked whether this was it. He said yes. She asked where he had found it. He said in a locked drawer in his mother's study. She asked what was in it, and Desmond paused, and for the first time in his life, he actually looked at June Calloway, not at her boots, not at her bag, at her, and June felt something open in a place she hadn't known was closed. He said letters from Emmett Vance, his father, written over the last 3 years of his life, addressed to him, never sent because his mother had taken them out of the mail and put them in a drawer. He said she, the way a grown man says a word he has been afraid of since he was 6 years old. Harriet asked what those letters said. Desmond's voice cracked and he steadied it. He said his father had written to tell him that a woman named June Calloway was owed money, that she was somewhere along the lake, that she had been sleeping outside since she was 10, and that if Emmett didn't find her in time, Desmond had to. The courtroom did not move. June's eyes filled, and she did not let them spill. Then Harriet said she had one last question, and she picked up a thin stack of pages from her table and asked him to look at the final item in the folder he had brought her. She asked him to read out the name on the payment schedule. And Desmond looked at the page, and his face changed in a way June would think about for years afterward, because he had clearly read it before and had clearly hoped right up until that second that he would not have to say it in a room with a court reporter in it. He said the name Gordon Ames. Harriet asked who Gordon Ames was. He said he didn't know, that he had never met the man that the payments ran quarterly for 9 years and stopped 4 years ago. And Harriet Nash turned around and looked at June, and June understood before the woman said a single word, because she had spent her whole life reading faces before the words arrived. Gordon Ames was the man who had walked into her mother's kitchen one afternoon when June was 9 and walked back out with her mother 3 months later. Harriet said it plainly for the court. She said the defendant had made quarterly payments for nearly a decade to the second husband of the beneficiary's mother. She said that in the same quarter those payments began, Della Calloway had stopped searching for her daughter. She said that the state had a record of exactly one inquiry made by Della Calloway about her child in the winter after her husband's death, and never another one. And she said that the reason for that was in the folder too, a letter of confirmation on the letterhead of a foundation. Cordelia Vance had personally chartered, stating that a minor named Juniper Rose Calloway had died in a residential fire. June stopped hearing the room, because that was the sentence Emmett Vance had been trying to say when he started coughing. That was the one more thing. Cordelia had not just taken her money. She had taken her mother, and then she had killed her on paper, because a dead child does not turn 21 and does not ask about a trust, and a grieving woman in another state does not knock on any doors. She had bought June's whole life for the price of a quarterly check to a man who had already stopped loving his wife. June sat there in a second-hand jacket and did the math she had been doing since she was 9. Every winter she had spent believing her mother chose to go. Every night she had lain awake, constructing the reason. She cried too much, she asked for too much, she was too much. 13 years of a child prosecuting herself for a crime that a woman in pearls had committed in an office with the door closed. She felt her whole body start to shake, and she pressed her palms flat against her thighs and held on. Harriet asked Desmond one final question. She asked whether, when his mother handed him those authorizations to sign, she had ever used the beneficiary's name. He did not look at his mother. He looked at June. He said yes. Harriet asked what she called her, and Desmond Vance said she called her the girl. Then he paused, and his voice went flat and strange, and he said, and then she called her the problem. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman breathed out like she'd been hit. Harriet said no further questions. Cordelia's attorney stood for cross-examination and asked Desmond whether he was aware that he stood to inherit a great deal more if the will were overturned. Desmond said he was aware. The attorney asked him whether he understood he had just testified himself out of several $1,000,000, and Desmond looked at him and said that his father had written him 11 letters, and he had never gotten to read a single one of them until 3 weeks ago, and that whatever the number was, it wasn't enough to be the man who kept that drawer locked. He stepped down. He walked past his mother's table without turning his head. The verdict came down 2 days later. The court upheld Emmett Vance's will in full. Every disputed trust asset was ordered returned to June Calloway, every routing, every shell, every transfer traced and named and reversed. Cordelia Vance's financial dealings were referred to the state attorney general and to federal authorities, and a separate referral went out on the fraudulent death record because there is a name for what she did to a mother in Vermont, and it is not accounting. June and Harriet walked out of the building side by side, and the reporters were waiting on the steps with the kind of hunger you can smell from a block away. June slowed at the top. Harriet touched her elbow and told her she didn't have to say anything. June looked at the microphones coming up like a wave and stepped forward anyway. Somebody shouted and asked if she felt vindicated. She stopped. A year ago, she hadn't known what that word meant. She had looked it up on a library computer 1 word out of 100 and written it in a cheap spiral notebook in handwriting she was embarrassed by. She knew what it meant now. She was not sure it described anything she was feeling. She said no. A dozen microphones leaned in. She said she felt sad. A camera lowered an inch. She said her parents had planned for her before she was born. She said a man named Emmett Vance had spent the last 3 years of his life trying to find her and had died before he could. And she said that people who were supposed to do the right thing had made a bet that nobody would check and nobody would care if one little girl disappeared inside the paperwork. Her voice steadied. She said there are a lot of people the world decides not to notice. She said she had been one of them for 13 years, and she had believed the world was right about her. Nobody on those steps said anything. She said that was what she felt, that she felt sad about how good all of us are at not noticing them. Then she stepped back from the microphones and walked down the stairs, and Harriet walked beside her, and neither of them said a word until they reached the car. That night, June stood in her own front room in front of a fireplace with a hidden ring under the ashes, and she looked at her father in a wooden frame and at a pale blue mitten with the letter D facing out, and she put her hand flat against the stone. She said, almost. Then she said it again, quieter, almost, Mom. She did not drive to Vermont the next morning, and she could not have explained why to anyone, and Harriet did not ask. She stayed a week. She fixed a shutter that had been hanging by one nail since before she was born. Otto taught her to bank a fire so it would still be warm at 6 in the morning, and she got it wrong 4 nights running, and right on the 5th, and she stood in the kitchen at dawn with her hands out to the heat like she'd invented it. The first 2 nights she slept in her boots. The 3rd night she took them off and set them by the bed where she could reach them. The 4th night she put them in the closet. By the 7th morning she was sleeping straight through until sunrise for the first time since she was 9 years old, and she woke up and lay still and listened to a house that belonged to her make its ordinary noises. Then she got up and put clothes in a cheap duffel bag she had bought new at a hardware store, one that still smelled like a factory, and left the faded blue canvas bag on the closet shelf, empty. The road from Harrow Bay to that town in Vermont takes about 9 hours. June Calloway drove it in 12. She pulled over twice on the shoulder for no reason at all except that her hands had gone numb on the wheel. She stopped at a gas station outside Burlington and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes without buying anything, staring at an exit sign, rehearsing sentences, and throwing every one of them away. Hello, my name is June. You knew me as Juniper. I'm not dead. She got out of the car 3 separate times and got back in. The address was on a narrow road at the edge of the village, and when she found the house, she did not slow down. She drove straight past it, went 4 miles, turned around in a church lot, and came back and parked at the curb, and sat there with the engine off for 10 minutes doing the only math she knew how to do. If she knocked and the woman inside was not the woman on the video, she could survive that. She had survived worse. But if she knocked and the woman inside was the woman on the video and looked at her and did not want her, then June Calloway would have absolutely no idea what to do with the rest of her life. She got out, she walked up the path. She climbed the steps, she raised her hand and could not make it move. She stood there with her fist in the air for so long that her arm started to shake, and then she lowered it and turned around and got 2 steps back down toward the car. Behind her, the door opened. The woman standing there was older than the photograph. Much older. Hair almost all silver thin at the shoulders, hands small and lined and gripping the frame like the frame was the only thing keeping her upright. But the eyes were the same. June had spent 13 years failing to remember those eyes. She remembered them now. Neither of them said anything. June's mouth was open and no sound was coming out of it. The woman's gaze moved down from June's face to her coat to her hands and stopped on the small pale blue thing June was holding, crushed in her fist, the letter D stitched in white thread. And Della Calloway's face broke, not all at once but slowly, the way a wall goes that has been holding for a very long time and has just now finally been asked to sit down. She put one hand out toward her daughter and did not touch her. Her fingers hovered in the air like she was afraid that touching would end it, that June would come apart or vanish or turn out to be a dream. She had let herself have too many times already. She said, "You kept it." June couldn't answer. She said it again. "You kept it." June nodded once, and her mother's knees gave out and she sat straight down on her own front steps in her cardigan, with her hands over her face, and June went down beside her and did not touch her either, because neither one of them knew yet what they were allowed to do. They sat there for a long time before anyone spoke. Della was the one who did it. She said, "I thought you were dead." June closed her eyes. She said, "He told me you were dead," and her voice cracked on the word he. June did not have to ask who. She said the name herself. Gordon Ames. Her mother made a sound like the name still cut her. She said there had been a fire. That's what he told her. A residential home outside Duluth in the middle of the night, and it was 3 weeks before he said anything, and when he did, he said it fast, and then never again. He said there was no point going to look at the paperwork that the state had lost children before, and covered it that the details would kill her, that she would not survive knowing. She said she believed him. June said for how long, and her mother said for too long, and then she said the thing that made June's chest go hollow. She said she had stopped believing him about 8 years ago, that something in her had simply refused one morning for no reason over dishes, and that by then he was already gone and she had no name to give anyone, no proof, no money. And every time she called an office, she was a woman who had abandoned her own child and whose second husband's story didn't track. She said she made 41 phone calls in 4 years. She said she wrote the state twice. She said the last time she called, a very kind young man told her that without a case number, he really couldn't help her, and she thanked him and hung up and sat on the kitchen floor. June said, "I was in Duluth." Her mother turned and looked at her. June said it again, quieter. "I was in Duluth that whole time. I was 90 minutes from where you were making those phone calls." And Della Calloway put both hands over her mouth and rocked forward, and June sat next to her mother on a porch step and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was rage, hot and instant, and aimed at nobody in the room, because 13 years had been spent by two people looking for each other in the dark, and a woman in pearls had known where both of them were the entire time. She told her mother that, sitting right there before either of them had even gone inside. June told her about a locked drawer in a study in Michigan, and quarterly payments running 9 years, and a letter of confirmation on foundation letterhead stating that a minor named Juniper Rose Calloway had died in a residential fire. Her mother went very, very still. Then she stood up and she said, "Wait here," and she went into the house and she was gone almost 4 minutes. When she came back, she had a folded piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times it had gone soft at the creases, and she put it into June's hands without a word. June opened it. It was the same letter, the same letterhead, the one Gordon Ames had put in front of her mother, 11 years ago as proof. Her mother said she had kept it because it was the only thing in the world that had her daughter's full name on it. June sat on the steps holding the paper that had murdered her, and she started to laugh. And the laugh turned into something with no bottom to it, and her mother caught her carefully, very carefully, the way you catch something that used to be small, and held on. Inside later at the kitchen table, they got the first hard part out of the way. June asked her why she left in the first place, not the lie, before the lie, why a woman goes out of state with a man 3 months after her husband drowns and leaves a 9-year-old with a caseworker and a promise. And Della Calloway did not defend herself. That was the thing June would remember. She did not say she was young or grieving or broke, though she had been all three. She said she had been told it would be 6 weeks. She said she had believed a man who was good at being believed, and that she had made a decision on a Tuesday that she had spent every day since paying interest on, and that she was not going to sit at her own table and explain it in a way that made it sound survivable. She said, "I left you. Everything after that was done to me, but that part I did." June looked at her for a long moment and said, "Okay, not I forgive you, just okay." And her mother nodded like she understood the difference exactly and did not ask for more. Then Della stood up and said there was something upstairs. The room at the end of the hall was small, a bed, a quilt, a rug, and at the foot of the bed, a wooden chest. Her mother knelt down in front of it, and her hands shook on the latch, and she lifted the lid. June looked inside and stopped breathing. 13 boxes, wrapped in 13 different papers, gold, red, blue, with white stars, soft pink, green, with a snowflake print, every one of them tied with a ribbon, every one of them with a small, handmade tag in her mother's handwriting. Juniper, age 10. Juniper, age 11. Juniper, age 12. June's knees hit the floor. She did not remember them buckling. Her mother said she had bought one every single year. She said she had kept doing it even in the years when she believed her daughter was in the ground, because she did not know how to stop, and because stopping felt like agreeing with the fire. June reached out one shaking hand and touched the green 1 snowflake print tag reading age 15. And she thought about herself at 15, sleeping outside a hardware store in Duluth with a bloody nose from the cold, waiting for the sun to come up so the coffee place would open, while a woman in a small house in Vermont sat on this floor and carefully tied a ribbon for her. Her mother said she could open one. June asked which one. Her mother said any of them. June reached all the way to the back to the smallest box, wrapped in yellow tissue paper gone brittle with age. The tag said, Juniper, age 10. The first one, the one from the year it happened. She lifted it. It weighed almost nothing. She looked at her mother, and her mother nodded with her lips pressed together, holding something in. June untied the ribbon and peeled the yellow tissue back. Inside was a mitten, pale blue, hand-knit, slightly crooked at the thumb, with the letter D stitched into the cuff in white thread. The other one. June took the mitten out of her coat pocket, the one she had carried through 6 foster homes in 11 cities and 13 winters, the one she had guarded in the side pouch of a canvas bag like it was a vital organ, and she laid the two of them side by side on the floor of that bedroom. A pair. After 13 years a pair. Her mother said in a voice that barely worked that she had knit them the winter June turned 9, and that June had lost one at the church, and that she had promised to make another. She said, I did make another. I made it that spring. I just never got to give it to you. And June Calloway made a sound she had never made before in her life and went forward into her mother's arms, and Della caught her and held on and said over and over, I came back. I did come back. I came back in April, and they told me the file was sealed. They stayed on the floor of that small bedroom for a long time because a decade of missing someone does not fit into sentences. It fits into a pair of mittens for a 9-year-old kept in a chest by a woman who never stopped believing that miracles were at least worth wrapping. June did not forgive her mother that afternoon. That is not how it works. Real is slower than that. Real was a mother saying, I don't expect anything from you, and a daughter saying, I don't know yet what I can give you, and both of them staying at the kitchen table anyway, drinking tea neither of them wanted until it got dark. Real was June, sleeping in the guest room that night with the door open and getting up at 2 in the morning out of pure habit to check the front lock, and finding her mother already sitting at the bottom of the stairs awake doing exactly the same thing. Real was a phone call the next week, and then a phone call the week after that. Real was a bad one in February, where June's anger finally arrived all at once. where she said out loud that Della should have come back sooner, should have kept calling, should have burned the state down looking for her. And her mother said, "You are right," and did not hang up and called again the next Sunday like nothing had happened, because she had decided that the price of coming back was letting her daughter be angry for as long as she needed to be. Real was March, when June mailed her the photograph of Emmett Vance's handwriting, and Della called her at 11 at night and asked in a very small voice whether he had suffered. And real was April, when Della Calloway came to Harrow Bay for the first time and stood in the front room of a house everybody in 3 counties had called worthless, and saw her husband's photograph on the mantel in a wooden frame and had to sit down. June took her downstairs. Her mother went into that yellow room and looked at the shelves and the boxes and the desk and the leather journal with a dead man's name on it, and she put her hand over her mouth and she said he was still trying. Not he tried, he was still trying. June had to leave the room for a minute. That same week, Harriet Nash drove out with paperwork and met Della in the kitchen, and the 2 women shook hands and sized each other up for about 4 seconds. Then Harriet, who had never once in 6 months said anything unnecessary, looked at her and said, "You raised a very stubborn young woman." And Della Calloway said, "No, I didn't raise her at all." Then she looked across the kitchen at her daughter standing in the doorway and said, "I would like to try to know her." And June stood there and heard it, heard that her mother had said, "Know not, have not, keep, not make up for." That was the sentence June could work with. The money came home in the spring, and June Calloway did not touch it for 6 weeks. It was more than she had ever let herself imagine having. Harriet sent the final accounting in a manila envelope, and June opened it at the kitchen table and looked at the number, and then put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in a drawer and went outside to fix a porch board. Otto asked her once what she was waiting for. She said she wasn't waiting. She said she was making sure it didn't turn her into somebody. He said that was the smartest thing he'd heard anybody say about money in 50 years, and handed her a hammer and taught her how to hold it so she'd stop hitting her own thumb. She fixed that porch board by board. She learned that she liked yellow kitchens. She learned that she liked the curtains open in the morning, and that she disliked decorative pillows with an intensity she could not explain to anyone. Small things, ordinary things. The kind of preferences a person only develops when they stay somewhere long enough to have them. Her mother moved into the apartment above the garage in May and insisted on paying rent, which made June laugh out loud for the first time in years, actually laugh from the stomach, and then argue about it for 2 days and then lose. And then on a cold Tuesday night at the end of April, driving home from Harriet's office, June went past the bus station in Duluth and saw a kid asleep against the wall with his backpack wrapped around one arm. She drove 3 blocks. She turned around. She sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes with the engine off, watching a boy who could not have been older than 19 sleep sitting up with his chin on his chest, and she did not get out of the car because she knew better than anyone alive that a stranger walking towards you at midnight is not a rescue, it is a threat. She drove home. She did not sleep. At 6 in the morning, she called Harriet Nash and said she needed to know how to build something, and Harriet said, "Build what?" And June said, "Doors that lock." Ground broke in October on 24 acres beside a leaning stone house on a shoreline that lost 10 inches a year. Not luxury anything. 9 cottages to start. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen, a porch light, and a front door with a lock on it, and a key that belonged to the person inside and to nobody else, not to a caseworker, not to a night monitor, not to June. Harriet built the nonprofit and fought the county over the zoning for 11 weeks and won. Otto ran the construction crew and complained about the concrete deliveries every single day for 2 months, and was June noticed quietly happier than she had ever seen him. Della cooked for the workers, started a garden nobody asked for, and made soup every Sunday until the crew started showing up on Sundays. June named it Lantern Row, not after Emmett. Emmett hadn't been perfect, and she was never going to pretend otherwise. He had waited too long, and 18 months of following money is 18 months of a girl sleeping outside, and she carried that. But regret means nothing at all unless it becomes a door with a lock in it, and his had. The first residents arrived in November, kids who had aged out of foster care, kids who had left home early because leaving was the safer option, kids the state had a file on and no place for. A county van pulled in and a girl got out, 18 years old, holding a black backpack with both hands, both straps, the way you hold something when you have already had one stolen. Her name was Nell. June said hello, and Nell nodded and did not smile, and June recognized that too. She told her the room was ready, and Nell looked past her at the cottage and asked the question. Not where is it, not is there Wi-Fi. She asked how long she could stay. June's chest closed. She felt her mother come up behind her on the path and put a hand on her arm. She looked at Nell and said they'd figure that out together, and Nell's eyes went to the door, and she asked whether the bedroom locked. And for one full second, June Calloway was 23 again, sitting in a conference room in a donation coat with a canvas bag, between her boots asking a room full of people in good suits the only question that had ever mattered. She said yes. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small silver key on a ring with a wooden tag hanging off it and held it out. She said it was hers, not a copy. Hers. Nell took it and looked down at it fast, but not fast enough, and June saw the tears and had the grace to turn and look at the trees for a second, because a key is never just a key, not to a girl who has never had one. By January, there were 9 of them, and Lantern Row had rules, and June had written all of them herself at the kitchen table with a pen and a legal pad. Nobody had to earn the door. Nobody got asked what they had done before. Nobody's bed disappeared because they missed a curfew or a meeting or a bad week. If you left, your key stayed yours for a year, because the thing that had broken June at 15 was not the leaving. It was knowing there was nothing to come back to. Harriet read the rules and took off her glasses and said no funder in America would sign off on that, and June said then they'd take money from somebody else. And Harriet, who was 68 years old and had been practicing law since before June's parents met, folded the paper, put it in her bag, and said, all right. 2 months later, a county van brought a woman instead of a kid. 60-something silver braid, a winter coat too thin for the shoreline. She had driven up on her own dime to volunteer 40 years as social worker in the state of Michigan, just retired. No idea what to do with her hands. She said her name was Bernice Tate. She shook June's hand and then held onto it a second too long and said June looked familiar and asked if they had met. June said yes. She said, you gave me a blanket. I was 17. I was crying in a hallway in Ashland because a boy in the men's dorm had said something to me, and you sat down next to me for 10 minutes and you never once asked me what was wrong. You just sat there. And I remember thinking, that woman doesn't know me, and she's still here. Bernice's eyes filled, and she couldn't say anything for a while. Then she said she had sat with a lot of girls, and she didn't remember all of them, and she was so sorry. June said she knew. She said she wasn't telling her to make her feel bad. She said she was telling her because for about a year afterward, whenever it got bad, she used to think about whichever girl stopped needing to sit in that hallway and how that was going to be somebody's life's work. Bernice pressed her hand over her mouth. June looked out at the 9 cottages, at the smoke coming off 9 little chimneys, at her mother walking down the path with a basket of muffins because Della Calloway had decided that muffins were a personality now. Then she looked back at Bernice Tate and said, you already did your life's work. Do you want to come see what happened next? Bernice nodded and could not speak, and June took her arm and they walked down the path together. The federal case took 18 months. June did not attend most of it. Harriet went. Harriet reported back in short sentences on Sunday nights. Cordelia Vance's attorneys tried the story about administrative errors again, and it died faster the second time because the letter on foundation letterhead, the one certifying that a minor named Juniper Rose Calloway had died in a fire that had never happened, had been generated on a computer in Cordelia's own office on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after Gordon Ames received his first payment. That was the thing that ended her, not the millions. A single fabricated document about a dead child that had never been necessary, that no accountant had suggested, that no lawyer had drafted. She had made it herself. She pled out in the end restitution, forfeiture, and a sentence long enough that people stopped writing about it after the first week. The plaque came down off the hospital wing in the fall. The foundations were dissolved, the assets redistributed, and a good portion of them went back into the exact shelters she had been draining: Duluth, Ashland, Marquette, Green Bay, which June found she had no feelings about at all, and then found 3 days later while doing dishes that she had a great many. Harriet asked her once if she wanted to write a victim statement for sentencing. June thought about it for a week. Then she wrote 4 sentences and mailed them to the court, and never told anybody what they said except her mother. And what they said was this: I was 9 when you decided I was a problem. I was 23 when I found out I had been solved on paper. You have to live now in a world where I am neither. That is enough for me. She did not go to the sentencing. She was pouring concrete for cottage number 10. Desmond Vance came to Harrow Bay once in the second spring. He stood at the end of the drive for a while before he came up, and June watched him do it through the window and let him take his time. He said he wasn't there to ask for anything. He said he'd sold his shares and moved to Wisconsin and was working for somebody else for the first time in his life, and it was going okay. Then he took an envelope out of his jacket and said his father's letters were in it all 11, and that he had read them so many times he could recite them, and that 4 of them were mostly about her. He said, I think you should have them. June said, they were written to you. And Desmond Vance stood on her porch and said, I know, but he spent the last 3 years of his life trying to put something in your hands, and I'm the reason it took this long, and I'd like to finish it. She took the envelope. She asked him if he wanted to come in. He said, no, not yet, maybe next time. And she said, all right, and he got in his car and drove away, and he did come back about a year later and stayed 2 days and fixed a generator and left without making a speech about it. Her mother had been right about knowing. It was slower than forgiving, and it lasted longer. By the 3rd year, Della had a garden that fed most of Lantern Row through August, and the residents called her by her first name and stole her cookies and told her things they did not tell June, which June had eventually stopped being jealous about. There was a night in that 3rd year, in the dead of winter, when a boy in Cottage 6 had a very bad hour, and Della sat on his porch step with him from 2 until almost 5 in the morning and never asked him what was wrong. She just sat there. June found out about it the next day and had to go stand in the yard for a minute. Nell stayed 19 months. She left for a 2-year program downstate and cried in the driveway. And June gave her the same speech she gave all of them, which was that the key stayed hers for a year. Nell mailed it back the following November with a note that said, I don't need it anymore. Give it to somebody who does. And then underneath, in smaller handwriting, I checked the lock once now. Not 3 times. Once. June read that standing at her own mailbox and had to sit down on the frozen ground. She had that note framed. It hung in the kitchen where the residents could see it, and every single one of them stopped and read it at some point in their first week, and June never once had to explain what it meant. There was a night late in that same year when June went upstairs after her mother had gone to bed and opened her bedroom closet and reached up to the top shelf. The blue canvas bag was still there, faded, broken strap. She took it down and held it in both hands, and it was so light she almost laughed, and an entire life had fit inside at once. 2 shirts, wool socks, a toothbrush, a photograph, 1 mitten, a folding knife, a chapstick from a shelter in Green Bay, a small chain off a Christmas ornament she had picked up off a sidewalk in Duluth at 17 because it was pretty, and because nothing in her life had been pretty in a while. That was everything. That was all of it. She sat down on the edge of her bed with the bag in her lap and thought about the 9-year-old on the church steps in the rain who kept waiting for a man in a black coat, the 11-year-old in the 3rd foster home who learned to sleep sitting up, the 15-year-old outside the hardware store with a bloody nose, the 17-year-old crying in a hallway in Ashland, the 22-year-old behind the laundromat who checked the bag before she checked her own face. And she said out loud in the quiet of her own bedroom to all of them at once, you did enough. Her voice cracked and she said it again. You did enough. You can put it down now. She stood up. She put the bag back on the shelf. She closed the closet door and she did not open it again. Down the hill, and porch lights were burning between the trees. 9 locked doors. 9 sets of keys. 9 people who knew exactly where they were sleeping tomorrow night and the night after that and could plan a week ahead, which is a thing that sounds like nothing until you have gone 13 years without it. At the end of Gull Ash Road, the mailbox had been repainted, and it said one word in fresh white letters, home. June went to the top of the stairs and sat down on the top step the way she had done 1,000 nights by then, elbows on her knees, and looked down at a fire. She had banked herself at her father in a wooden frame at a pair of pale blue mittens, laid side by side on the mantel where anybody walking in could see them at her mother's teacup still on the kitchen table. And she let herself have one thought. This was what he meant. Not the money, not the trust, not even the truth about what had been done to her, just this. The space at the top of your own stairs where you can sit down and not have to go anywhere. She went down to the kitchen. Her mother had left the light on over the stove and a cup out for the morning and a chair pulled back from the table because Della Calloway pulled that chair out every single night on purpose, and neither of them had ever once talked about why. June locked the front door. Once. She did not check it again, because a legacy is not a house, and it is not a fortune, and it is not a name on a plaque in a hospital wing that somebody can take down with a screwdriver. A legacy is 9 porch lights burning on a shoreline that everyone said was worthless, and a girl who was written off as dead deciding to stay in a chair pulled out at a kitchen table for someone who spent 13 years believing nobody had ever saved one for her. June Calloway had a lock, a key, and a mother waiting in the morning. She was home, and she was never running again.